What do you do when a war that isn't yours suddenly lands a live warhead in your backyard? And what do you do when it's not even the first time, but the fifth? Before we get into what happened that night, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear is the closest NATO has come to direct confrontation with Russia in years, and this story is still moving fast. It started with a warning. Late on the night of July 30th, Ukraine's president posted a message online, telling citizens across the country to get to shelters immediately. Russian strategic bombers had just been spotted taking off, and anyone who understood what that meant knew a massive strike was coming within hours. This wasn't guesswork. It was a pattern Ukraine had learned to read the hard way, after years of watching Russia's bombers roll out before every major wave of attacks. They were right to be afraid. Within hours, Russia launched one of the largest combined assaults of the entire war. Close to 360 drones and missiles were fired in a single night, aimed squarely at Ukrainian cities. Ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, hypersonic weapons, all mixed together into one overwhelming wave, designed specifically to saturate Ukraine's air defenses until something, somewhere, slipped through the cracks. But this time, something was different. Instead of concentrating on Ukraine's usual targets in the east and south, a large share of that night's missiles were aimed at cities in the far west of the country, near Lviv and Ivano-Frankivsk. That decision mattered because it put the missile flight paths right along the edge of Poland, a NATO member state, and one of Ukraine's most important allies. Whether by accident or design, Russia was flying its weapons closer to NATO's front door than it had in a long time. Ukraine's air defenses fought hard that night, and by any measure, they performed well. They intercepted more than 50 missiles and hundreds of drones before they could reach the ground. But not everything was stopped. Some of what got through hit residential areas, and innocent people lost their lives before sunrise. And then one missile did something no one wanted to see happen. It didn't stay inside Ukrainian airspace like the rest. It kept flying west, and it crossed straight into Poland. On the other side of that border, the night had already been tense for hours, long before that missile ever crossed the line. Polish fighter jets had been in the air since 2 a.m, patrolling close to the Ukrainian border as a precaution, exactly the kind of readiness that comes from years of watching this war unfold next door. An early warning aircraft was flying overhead, sweeping the skies for anything unusual. Ground-based air defense systems and radar networks were at their highest level of alert. Poland wasn't caught off guard that night. They knew something enormous was happening just across the border, and they were watching every single second of it unfold in real time. Then, at around 3:40 in the morning, radar operators picked up something unusual, a fast-moving object heading west, straight toward Polish territory. A Polish F-16 was scrambled immediately to chase it down, engines screaming into the dark sky. Just a few minutes later, at 3:46, the object vanished from radar completely. No explosion on the screen, no clear reading, just a signal that was there one moment and gone the next. At almost that exact same moment, residents of a small area called Tarnowatka, near the city of Lublin, were jolted awake by a massive explosion. Windows rattled in their frames. Sirens started wailing across the region as people stumbled out of bed, unsure of what was happening or whether it was safe to stay inside. Nobody knew yet what had just occurred, but everyone understood, almost instantly, that this was serious. A helicopter was sent out to search the area where the radar signal had disappeared. What the crew found on the ground was hard to ignore. A crater, roughly 10 meters wide, sitting in the middle of an open field, just about 2 kilometers from the nearest homes. Debris was scattered across the surrounding grass. This wasn't a drone. This wasn't a stray piece of shrapnel that had drifted off course. Something with real destructive power had come down on Polish soil, close enough to a village that a slightly different trajectory could have meant a very different, far more tragic morning. Poland's prime minister dropped everything the moment he heard. He canceled his entire schedule for the day and went straight to the crash site, bringing his defense and interior ministers with him. Standing in that field, surrounded by scorched earth and broken debris, he spoke to the public in a way that cut straight through the usual diplomatic caution countries reach for in moments like this. He said that if the missile had continued its flight, if it had shown any sign of pushing further into Polish airspace or toward populated areas, Poland was ready to shoot it down. That single sentence tells you almost everything you need to know about where Poland's patience currently stands. And Poland wasn't the only country trying to intercept that missile before it ever hit the ground. According to the Prime Minister himself, Ukrainian fighter jets had also given chase that night, tracking missiles heading toward the Polish border and trying to bring them down before they ever crossed the line. 2 nations, working almost in parallel, both racing against the same clock to stop an incident that ultimately happened anyway. By morning, NATO's own machinery had started turning as well. The alliance's European military headquarters announced that Polish and NATO air and ground defenses had been jointly activated in response. 2 Polish F-16s were refueled mid-air by a NATO tanker aircraft, keeping them ready to respond at a moment's notice throughout the day. Senior NATO commanders were on direct phone calls with Poland's top military officials, coordinating the response as new information came in, and Poland's foreign minister made sure there was no room left for Russian denial. He stated plainly that the specific missile involved, the KH-101, is a weapon operated exclusively by Russian strategic aviation. No other country flies it. No other military could have launched it. There was no ambiguity whatsoever about who was responsible for what had landed in that field. Whatever the explanation for why it landed there turned out to be. There's also a strange detail that makes this entire night feel even heavier. Just one day before the missile hit, Ukraine's president had actually been in Lublin, meeting face-to-face with Poland's prime minister, discussing the exact kind of cooperation that would be needed if something like this ever happened along their shared border. Less than 24 hours later, it did. Now here's where things get complicated and where a lot of people online got genuinely confused watching this unfold. If Russia just hit a NATO country with a missile, why isn't NATO treating this as an attack on the entire alliance? Why isn't the world talking about war? This comes down to one very specific and very narrow legal detail buried inside NATO's founding treaty. Article 5, the famous clause stating that an attack on one member is treated as an attack on all, only applies when there is a deliberate, targeted military action against a member state. Not an accident, not a stray missile that wandered off its intended path. A deliberate, intentional attack with clear evidence behind it. Poland's official position, at least for now, has been careful and deliberate in its own right. The Prime Minister stated there is no evidence Poland was specifically targeted that night. Their working assessment is that the missile veered off its intended course during the broader strike on western Ukraine and ended up crossing the border by mistake. Legally speaking, without solid proof of intent, this cannot be classified as an act of war. It's being classified instead as an extremely dangerous incident, a distinction that carries enormous legal and political weight. NATO's Secretary General used almost identical language after speaking directly with Poland's leadership, describing it as a reckless act and a dangerous consequence of Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine, but carefully stopping short of calling it a deliberate strike against NATO territory. But here's the part that should genuinely make you pause and think. There's another article inside NATO's treaty, Article 4, which allows any member state to call an emergency consultation simply because their security is being threatened. It doesn't require proof of a deliberate attack. It doesn't require intent to be established at all. It only requires a genuine, credible security concern. And as of right now, according to a NATO official speaking to international media, there are no current plans to invoke that article either. That might not sound especially significant until you realize this isn't unprecedented territory for Poland at all. Article 4 has already been triggered 3 separate times since this war began, and the most recent instance was strikingly similar to what just happened. Last September, during another massive Russian strike on Ukraine, nearly 20 Russian drones crossed directly into Polish airspace in a single night. Poland invoked Article 4 immediately. Polish F-16s, working alongside Dutch F-35s, shot down at least 3 of those drones over Polish soil. It marked the first time in NATO's entire history that alliance forces had opened fire on Russian assets inside their own airspace. A genuinely historic moment that barely made headlines outside the region. Now sit with that contrast for a moment, because it's genuinely strange when you compare the two events side by side. Unarmed decoy drones, carrying no explosives at all, were enough to trigger a formal NATO article and an actual armed shoot-down last September. But this time, a live cruise missile, one that detonated with enough force to leave a 10-meter crater in the ground near a Polish village, is currently being handled through phone calls, careful public statements, and quiet diplomatic language. Why the difference? Because underneath all of this sits a genuine, uncomfortable dilemma that NATO has been wrestling with since the very first month of this war. React too aggressively to every single violation, and you risk a chain reaction that ends in direct military confrontation with a nuclear-armed Russia, something no one in Brussels wants to trigger by accident. React too passively, on the other hand, and you slowly teach Moscow that these violations come with no meaningful consequences at all, eroding deterrence one quiet incident at a time, until the line that used to matter simply stops meaning anything. A Ukrainian political analyst offered an assessment that's genuinely hard to forget once you hear it. He said Russia isn't doing this by pure coincidence. They may frame every incident as an unfortunate accident, a missile that simply wandered off course in the chaos of war. But this has now happened before, more than once, in strikingly similar circumstances. What's really happening, in his view, is that Moscow is quietly testing NATO's limits. Every single incident, and every response or lack of response that follows it, hands the Kremlin another data point, another small piece of information about exactly how far it can push before something actually changes on the other side. That's a genuinely unsettling idea to sit with. The thought that behind every one of these so-called accidents, there might be a slow, deliberate experiment running in real time, quietly measuring exactly how much NATO is willing to tolerate before it responds with real force. But here's something that calculation might be getting badly wrong. Poland is not a country that responds to pressure by shrinking away from it. And to understand exactly why, we need to talk about what Poland has quietly built over the last 4 years, because the numbers involved are genuinely staggering. If this story is opening your eyes to how close this war really is to spilling over NATO's borders, make sure you're subscribed, because we're about to look at exactly how prepared Poland actually is for a moment just like this one. Back in 2022, when Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine first began, Poland's entire annual defense budget sat at a little over $15 billion. That was roughly 2.4% of the country's GDP, a respectable figure by European standards, but nothing especially remarkable compared to other NATO members at the time. Fast forward to the 2026 budget, and that number has completely and dramatically transformed. Poland's finance minister confirmed a defense budget of roughly $55 billion this year, which works out to about 4.8% of the entire country's GDP. To put that number in perspective, the United States currently spends around 3.2% of its GDP on defense. The United Kingdom sits close to 2.4%. Germany and France both hover somewhere around 2%. NATO set an ambitious long-term target of 5% of GDP for defense spending at its June summit this year, a number most analysts assumed would take the alliance's wealthiest, largest economies years to reach. Instead, the first country expected to actually cross that 5% threshold isn't the United States at all. It's Poland. So where exactly is all of that money going? Based on detailed defense analysis, Poland is currently running the largest arms procurement program seen anywhere in Europe in modern history, a buying spree on a scale the continent genuinely hasn't seen in decades. We're talking about 366 Abrams tanks purchased directly from the United States, nearly 1,000 K2 Black Panther tanks, alongside hundreds of K9 self-propelled howitzers, both coming from South Korea in one of the largest defense export deals in that country's history. Long-range rocket launch systems capable of striking deep behind enemy lines, domestically produced Borsuk infantry fighting vehicles, or rolling straight off Polish assembly lines and into active units. For the skies above all of this, Patriot missile defense batteries, Apache attack helicopters, and an entire growing fleet of F-35 stealth fighter jets, with the very first deliveries already arriving this year. The total value of these combined orders exceeds $100 billion, an almost unimaginable sum for a country of Poland's size just a few years ago. One defense researcher summed up exactly what this enormous buildup means in practical terms. Modern armor, long-range artillery, and advanced layered air defense systems are now forming a genuine shield running the entire length of NATO's eastern border. A shield specifically engineered to crush any potential aggressor's hope of achieving a fast, decisive breakthrough. It's not just equipment either. Poland is also aggressively expanding its manpower at the same time. The country currently maintains around 216,000 active personnel, including territorial defense forces, already making it one of the largest land forces anywhere in NATO Europe. Poland's defense ministry has set an ambitious target of 300,000 troops by the year 2035. The army itself is being restructured into a 4-division formation, and the unit anchoring the entire eastern flank has been given a name that leaves absolutely no room for misunderstanding about its purpose, the Iron Division. Then there's what's happening underground and along the physical borders themselves, work that rarely makes international headlines but matters enormously. In 2024, the Polish government launched a massive fortification project stretching along its borders with Belarus and Russia's Kaliningrad exclave, covering roughly 700 kilometers in total. This includes anti-tank ditches dug 4 meters deep, concrete anti-tank barriers, commonly known as dragon's teeth or hedgehogs, hardened bunkers, logistics and supply depots, and AI-powered surveillance, and drone detection systems scanning the entire border around the clock, day and night. By the end of 2025, the project had already completed 60 kilometers of fortifications and 13 supply depots. The target for 2026 alone is to push that number past 200 kilometers of completed defenses. Poland has even applied for over 10 billion euros in funding from the European Union's newly created defense programs, specifically to help finish the job faster. Now, go back and reread that one sentence the Prime Minister said after the missile hit Polish soil. "We were ready to shoot it down." Knowing everything you now know about what Poland has spent the last 4 years quietly building, brick by brick and billion by billion, that sentence doesn't sound like a bluff from a nervous, cornered nation trying to appear tough for the cameras. It sounds like the calm, grounded confidence of a country that has spent every single year of this war methodically preparing for exactly this kind of moment. But that raises an obvious question worth asking directly. Out of every single country in Europe, why does it keep being Poland? Why do Russian drones and missiles keep ending up specifically in Polish skies, again and again, year after year. The answer becomes obvious the moment you look at a map. Poland shares a border with Ukraine stretching more than 500 kilometers. For the entire duration of this war, that border has served as the primary gateway for Western military support flowing into Ukraine, the physical lifeline keeping Ukraine's defense effort alive. In the far northeast of the country sits one of NATO's most dangerously narrow and vulnerable points, a strip of land known as the Suwałki Gap, squeezed tightly between Russia's Kaliningrad exclave on one side and Belarus on the other. This narrow corridor happens to be the only land connection linking the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to the rest of mainland Europe. In other words, Poland isn't just another member of the alliance sitting quietly on the sidelines. It's the gateway and the anchor point, holding together NATO's entire eastern flank. If Poland becomes unstable or falls under sustained pressure, the consequences ripple outward through every country connected to it. And that gateway has a beating heart of its own, an airport called Rzeszów, sitting less than 100 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Since this war first began, the single airport has functioned as the central logistics hub for nearly all Western military aid flowing into Ukraine. According to reporting cited by international outlets, roughly 95% of the military assistance arriving from more than 40 different countries passes through this one location before continuing onward toward Ukraine, typically by train from that point forward. World leaders traveling to meet with Ukraine's government almost always land here first as well, before making the final leg of their journey overland. This single, relatively small airport is, in very real terms, the artery keeping Ukraine's entire war effort alive. And Moscow understands exactly how important it is, arguably better than most people in the West ever have. You can see that understanding reflected clearly in a troubling pattern of incidents across Poland stretching back over the past 2 years. In 2024, a devastating fire tore through a massive shopping complex in Warsaw, destroying more than 1,400 individual stores in a single night. It was later confirmed to be an arson attack backed by Russian intelligence. After that came a disturbing string of suspicious fires and explosions targeting subway infrastructure, electrical substations, and warehouses connected to Poland's growing defense industry. By November, things escalated even further when an explosive device detonated directly on a railway line connecting Warsaw to the Ukrainian border through Lublin, a direct hit on one of the most critical transport routes used for moving aid shipments toward the front. Poland's prime minister publicly called it an unprecedented act of sabotage against his country. Investigators later identified 2 suspects believed to have direct links to Russian intelligence services, both of whom fled across the border into Belarus almost immediately after carrying out the attack. Prosecutors have since classified the entire case under terrorism charges. There's one more chilling detail worth mentioning here. During that drone incursion back in September of last year, several of the drones that crossed into Polish airspace were found to be flying on trajectories pointed directly toward Rzeszów, the very airport keeping Ukraine's supply lines open and functioning. Poland's interior minister at the time summed up exactly what this meant in blunt, unmistakable terms. He said the country was facing a foreign state carrying out hostile, militarily kinetic actions on Polish soil, something Poland had genuinely never experienced before in its modern history, not even during the darkest years of the Cold War. Put all of that together, and the full picture becomes impossible to ignore. Poland keeps ending up caught in the crossfire not because of bad luck or unfortunate coincidence, but because of geography and strategic purpose. It sits exactly where Russia would need to disrupt operations if it ever wanted to seriously cut off the flow of support currently keeping Ukraine's defense alive. So with everything Poland has built and everything it's actively protecting along its borders, what exactly is Russia choosing to send across that line? This is where the details of that night's missile strike start to get genuinely strange and genuinely revealing. We're only about halfway through uncovering just how deep this particular rabbit hole actually goes, so if you want the full picture laid out clearly, stay with us. And if this analysis is giving you a clearer, more complete understanding than anything else you've watched on this topic, that's exactly what sharing this video does for someone else out there who still needs to see it too. Take a close look at the official inventory of weapons Ukraine's Air Force reported being launched that single night, and something immediately looks strange, almost out of place. 61 Kh-101 and Kaliber cruise missiles, 4 Zircon and Onyx anti-ship missiles, 9 ballistic missiles, several identified specifically as Iskander systems, Dalardit, and at least one believed to be a KN-23, a North Korean-designed ballistic missile system. There are really only 3 possible explanations for a gap that dramatic. Russia is burning through its existing stockpiles significantly faster than they can be replaced through new production, or production is somehow being scaled up dramatically behind closed doors, hidden from public view. Or eventually and inevitably, the frequency and scale of these massive strikes will simply have to slow down out of pure necessity. These oddly mismatched missile salvos, where weapons originally designed for one specific purpose are being redirected toward an entirely different one, are very likely a direct symptom of exactly this kind of underlying pressure. Whatever remains sitting in the arsenal is simply being used, regardless of whether it was ever designed for the job it's now being assigned. So why does this depleted, mismatched, improvised arsenal keep breaking through Ukrainian defenses so successfully night after night? Because there's a matching shortage sitting on the other side of this equation as well, and Russia is fully aware of exactly how deep that shortage runs. The Patriot missile system remains the only truly reliable defense capable of intercepting incoming ballistic missiles with any real consistency. And according to Ukrainian Air Force officials speaking candidly about the situation, the shortage of Patriot interceptor missiles isn't just a Ukrainian problem anymore. It has quietly become a global one, affecting multiple countries who rely on the exact same limited supply chain. Russia appears to be deliberately exploiting this gap, and the tactic itself works in carefully layered stages. First, cheap drone swarms are sent in specifically to force mobile air defense teams to burn through their limited ammunition, responding to threats that, on their own, pose relatively little danger. Then cruise missiles follow close behind, stretching what remains of the defense network even thinner across a wider area. Finally, all ballistic missiles are threaded directly through whatever gaps remain open by that point, exploiting the exhaustion of everything that came before them. The results from that single night tell the entire story on their own, without needing much further explanation. Ukraine's defenses achieved a nearly flawless interception rate against incoming cruise missiles that night, a genuinely impressive performance under enormous pressure. But when it came to ballistic missiles specifically, only 1 out of 9 was successfully intercepted and stopped. The interceptor shortage became so severe by that point in the night that even mobile air defense teams, systems never designed or intended for this kind of high-speed target, were forced to attempt shooting down cruise missiles themselves, simply to fill the widening gaps left elsewhere in the network. Step back now and look at the bigger picture forming across all of this, and Russia's overall strategy appears to rest on 3 clearly connected goals working together. Wear down Ukraine's air defenses night after night through relentless, repeated pressure that never gives them a chance to fully recover or rebuild. Quietly test, incident by incident, exactly how NATO chooses to respond to each new violation of its airspace or territory, and chip away steadily at public support across the West by feeding the growing fear that this war could eventually spill over well beyond Ukraine's own borders and into everyone else's backyard. There's also a reason this entire strategy remains sustainable at all, and it has surprisingly little to do with raw military strength on its own. Poland's own foreign minister pointed out publicly that Russia simply could not continue funding a war of this scale and duration without its deepening trade relationship with China. If Beijing genuinely wanted this war to end tomorrow, most analysts believe it likely has more than enough economic leverage to force that outcome fairly quickly. But the war currently benefits China in its own quiet way, as Russia becomes increasingly economically dependent on its much larger neighbor with each passing year, selling oil and resources at steep discounts just to keep the war machine funded and running. Now, an honest and fair look at this story has to give the other side of the argument a genuine hearing too, rather than rushing straight to the darkest possible conclusion. What if this missile really was just an accident? Exactly as Poland's cautious official language suggests. There are legitimate, technically sound reasons to seriously consider that possibility. Cruise missiles can genuinely lose their intended course when flying through heavily contested electronic warfare environments, where jamming and signal interference are constantly active on both sides. This kind of interference is real, well documented, and it absolutely can send a missile's guidance system drifting off track in genuinely unpredictable ways that even the operators launching it might not fully anticipate. On top of that, full identification of the exact missile type and who specifically fired it hadn't been 100% confirmed at the moment Poland's prime minister first spoke publicly about the incident. He specifically said that while all available evidence pointed toward a Russian Kh-101 missile, officials wanted absolute certainty before drawing any final conclusions publicly, a genuinely responsible and measured approach rather than a rush to judgment under pressure. And Poland's official government position, even now, continues to maintain that there's no clear, hard evidence the country was deliberately targeted that night. There's also a painful past event that makes this kind of institutional caution completely understandable, rather than merely diplomatic. Back in November of 2022, a missile struck a small Polish village near the Ukrainian border, and 2 Polish citizens tragically lost their lives in the explosion. In the panicked hours immediately afterward, suspicion instantly and understandably fell on Russia, and serious conversations about invoking Article 5 began almost immediately across NATO capitals. But when the full investigation eventually concluded weeks later, the real story turned out to be far more complicated than anyone initially assumed. The missile debris actually belonged to a Ukrainian air defense system, one that had been fired while desperately trying to intercept an incoming Russian attack overhead. It was an accident, yes, but not remotely the one anyone had initially assumed in those first chaotic hours. That single event stands today as a powerful, sobering lesson about the genuine danger of rushing to conclusions before every fact has been properly confirmed and verified. But here's where the other side of this particular argument becomes considerably harder to dismiss, no matter how much caution feels warranted. This time, the underlying technical situation is genuinely and provably different. As officials pointed out clearly and repeatedly, the KH-101 missile is operated exclusively, without exception, by Russian strategic aviation forces. There is simply no possibility of mistaken ownership this time around, unlike the earlier and more ambiguous 2022 incident. The real question this time was never really about who fired the missile in the first place. It has always been entirely about intent, and intent alone. There's one final piece of context worth mentioning that reinforces this entire argument even further. Russia's own Ministry of Defense proudly announced conducting a large-scale precision strike against military targets inside Ukraine that same night, celebrating the operation publicly through their usual channels, but they said absolutely nothing whatsoever about the crater that appeared in Poland. Their embassy left every single request for comment completely unanswered in the days that followed, and that particular silence matters a great deal, because genuine accidents are almost always followed by some form of acknowledgement, explanation, or at minimum, a formal apology, issued through diplomatic channels. Deliberate tests, on the other hand, simply don't require any explanation at all. They only need results, quietly observed and carefully recorded somewhere far from public view, measured public language, and a quiet, ongoing promise to keep watching closely for whatever happens next. What we do know for certain, beyond any reasonable doubt, is this. Poland isn't the same country it was back in 2022, not even close. Every tank, every kilometer of fortified border, every single billion added to that dramatically expanded defense budget exists precisely because of nights exactly like this one. The next time something crosses that border, whether it's another drone, another wandering missile, or something far more serious and deliberate, Poland won't be reacting from a place of fear or uncertainty. It will be reacting from a position of genuine readiness, one built patiently, deliberately, and expensively over 4 long years for precisely this kind of moment. So here's the real question worth sitting with long after this video ends. Was this missile truly just an accident, exactly as the cautious official language suggests? Or was it a calculated test, carefully designed to measure exactly how far Russia can push before NATO finally decides to push back for real? And if it happens again, and given the pattern of the last 4 years, it very likely will, should Poland shoot first and explain the details later? Or does this current restraint remain the only real thing standing between contained conflict and something far more dangerous spreading across the continent? Type your answer down in the comments below, because this conversation genuinely matters right now. The more people who truly understand what's actually happening along NATO's eastern edge, the harder it becomes for incidents exactly like this one to quietly slip by unnoticed and unaddressed. If this video helped you see the full picture more clearly than before, share it with someone who still assumes this war stays neatly contained inside Ukraine's own borders, and subscribe if you want to stay ahead of whatever happens next, because based on everything we just walked through together, this almost certainly won't be the last time we're talking about Poland.